I sit at my kitchen table at midnight, staring at my phone buzzing with yet another call from Morrison and Associates law firm. I let it go to voicemail. The 23rd call this week. 3 days ago, I typed a single-sentence resignation letter after 11 years of dedicated service at Pinnacle Financial Group. One sentence that my former employer's legal team is now desperately trying to understand. I pick up the phone and listen to the frantic voicemail from their attorney, David Morrison, asking what exactly I meant by effective upon full completion of pending compliance audit. 3 weeks ago, everything was normal. I woke up every morning at 6:30, made coffee in my favorite blue ceramic mug, and drove my reliable Honda Civic 20 minutes through downtown Chicago traffic to reach the glass tower that housed Pinnacle Financial Group. For 11 years, I had been their senior compliance manager, a position I took seriously because I understood that behind every regulation and every audit was a family trusting us with their future. My name is Delilah Carter. And at 34, I had built what I thought was an unshakable career in financial compliance. The plaque on my desk read, Employee of the Year twice over, and my performance reviews consistently earned the highest ratings. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park with my 16-year-old daughter Emma, who played varsity soccer and dreamed of studying veterinary medicine at Northwestern University. Pinnacle Financial Group was a mid-sized investment firm that managed approximately $400 million in client assets. The company had been family-owned for 30 years, founded by Marcus Thornton, a man in his early 60s who still wore suspenders and believed in firm handshakes and keeping your word. His nephew Bradley Thornton, 38 years old and ambitious beyond his actual abilities, had recently been promoted to vice president and was clearly positioning himself to take over the family business. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I arrived at 7:15, grabbed my second cup of coffee from the break room, and settled into my corner office overlooking the Chicago River. My quarterly compliance audit was due the following week, a routine review that I had conducted without incident for the past 6 years. The process involved examining client account statements, verifying transaction documentation, and ensuring our firm maintained adherence to all federal and state regulatory requirements. By 10:30 that morning, I had reviewed approximately 40 client files when something caught my attention. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, a 78-year-old widow from Evanston, had withdrawn $250,000 from her retirement account, according to our internal records. However, the withdrawal authorization form showed her signature dated 3 days after her account balance had already been reduced. The math didn't work, and Mrs. Ashford's handwriting looked distinctly different from her signature on file from account opening 5 years earlier. I pulled 3 more random files and found similar discrepancies. Mr. James Patterson, a teacher saving for his daughter's college tuition, showed a wire transfer of $85,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. When I called his home number to verify the transaction, his wife informed me they had never authorized any international transfers and had no accounts outside the United States. My stomach began to knot as I expanded my review to include electronic records. The bank routing numbers for these suspicious transfers all led to the same offshore institution, Caribbean Financial Holdings, which had no legitimate business relationship with our firm. More troubling, the authorization codes for these transactions had been processed through our executive override system, a feature that required senior management approval. I spent my lunch hour calling 5 additional clients whose files showed irregularities. 3 of them had no knowledge of the transactions listed in their accounts. The 4th had passed away 2 months earlier, yet her account showed active trading during the past week. The fifth client, a retired police officer named Frank Sullivan, became angry when I described the $40,000 withdrawal from his account because he had specifically instructed us never to move money without his written consent. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I had documented suspicious activity totaling $2.8 million across 17 different client accounts. The pattern was consistent large withdrawals or transfers to offshore accounts, often using forged or backdated authorization forms, with all transactions processed through executive override codes that bypassed normal approval procedures. I knew I had to report this immediately, but I also understood the gravity of what I had discovered. Financial fraud at this scale could destroy the firm, devastate client families, and potentially result in federal criminal charges for everyone involved. I spent another hour creating copies of all relevant documentation, storing backup files on a secure personal drive, and preparing a summary report that clearly outlined the scope and timeline of the irregularities. At 4:30, I knocked on Marcus Thornton's office door. He welcomed me with his usual warmth, asking about Emma's soccer season and commenting on the beautiful autumn weather. When I spread the documents across his mahogany desk and explained what I had found, his expression changed dramatically. Marcus stared at the papers for several long minutes before looking up at me with eyes that seemed suddenly much older. Instead of the shock or anger I expected, he appeared defensive and uncomfortable. He asked whether I was certain about my findings, suggesting that perhaps I had misunderstood some of the transactions or overlooked legitimate explanations. When I showed him the forged signatures and impossible dates, he became quiet and then asked a question that chilled me. He wanted to know who else I had spoken with about this matter and whether I had shared my concerns with anyone outside the company. I assured him that I had followed proper protocol by bringing the matter directly to him first. Then Marcus said something that changed everything. He told me that Bradley had been working hard to modernize our operations, and that this kind of investigation could damage family relationships that had taken decades to build. He suggested that perhaps some of these irregularities could be explained by new electronic processing systems that I might not fully understand. I felt my professional world beginning to shift beneath my feet. This wasn't the response of a CEO learning about potential fraud in his company. This was the response of someone who already knew something was wrong and wanted to keep it quiet. I reminded Marcus that as compliance manager investigating irregularities was precisely my assigned duty, and that federal law required us to report suspected fraud immediately. His response shocked me completely. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair and told me that my job was to ensure compliance, not to create problems that could destroy a family business. He suggested that I focus on my assigned duties and remember that Bradley would soon be taking on greater leadership responsibilities. The implication was clear: question Bradley's activities at your own risk. I left his office feeling confused, betrayed, and deeply concerned about what I had stumbled into. The man I had respected and trusted for 11 years had essentially asked me to ignore evidence of massive financial fraud. As I drove home that evening, I realized that my choice was no longer between following protocol and keeping quiet. My choice was between protecting my job and protecting the families whose life savings were being stolen. That night after Emma went to bed, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision that would change everything. I was going to continue investigating regardless of the consequences. The next morning, I arrived at work an hour earlier than usual. The office building was nearly empty, which gave me the privacy I needed to dig deeper into the electronic records. I had barely slept the previous night, my mind racing with questions about how extensive this fraud might be and who else might be involved. I started by pulling up our master client database and running queries for all transactions processed through executive override codes during the past 18 months. What I discovered made my hands shake as I scrolled through page after page of suspicious activity. The pattern wasn't random or opportunistic. This was systematic theft carefully orchestrated and deliberately hidden. 63 client accounts showed unauthorized activity totaling over $8.2 million. The transfers followed the same pattern. Funds moved to intermediary accounts, then quickly transferred to Caribbean Financial Holdings or similar offshore institutions. Most disturbing, the timing corresponded exactly with Bradley Thornton's promotion to vice president and his increased access to executive override systems. I pulled up the email server and began searching for correspondence related to Caribbean Financial Holdings. What I found in Bradley's sent messages folder made my blood run cold. Email chains dating back 14 months showed detailed discussions with an external accountant named Richard Webb about temporary borrowing from client accounts to cover operational shortfalls and investment opportunities. One email from Bradley to Webb dated 6 months earlier was particularly damning. Bradley had written, "The quarterly audit is coming up, but Delilah always focuses on the standard compliance checklist. As long as we keep the temporary transfers under her usual review threshold and restore funds before monthly statements go out, we can continue using this liquidity strategy. The old man doesn't understand modern finance, but he trusts me to handle the details." My heart pounded as I realized they had been using my own predictable audit patterns to hide their theft. They knew exactly how I conducted reviews and had specifically structured their fraud to avoid my standard procedures. I had been unknowingly providing them cover for 18 months of systematic stealing from our clients. I printed copies of the most incriminating emails and transaction records, storing them in a locked file cabinet in my office. But I needed someone else to corroborate what I was seeing, someone who had access to the accounting side of these transactions. Janet Rodriguez worked in our accounting department and had been with the firm for 7 years. She was meticulous, honest, and had always seemed uncomfortable whenever Bradley Thornton visited her department. At lunchtime, I asked Janet to join me at the small cafe across the street from our building. After ordering coffee and sandwiches, I carefully explained that I was reviewing some transaction irregularities and wondered whether she had noticed anything unusual in the accounting records. Janet's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Her face went pale and she glanced around the cafe nervously before leaning closer to speak in a whisper. She told me she had been noticing discrepancies for months, but had been instructed by her supervisor to process transactions without asking questions about documentation. Janet revealed that Bradley Thornton had implemented new processing procedures that bypassed traditional verification steps for what he called time-sensitive investment opportunities. She had been required to transfer client funds based solely on his electronic authorization without the usual paperwork trail or client confirmation calls that had been standard practice for years. More troubling, Janet had been keeping her own informal records because something felt wrong about these transactions. She had copies of transfer authorizations that showed client funds being moved to accounts that didn't appear in our official records system. When she had asked her supervisor about this, she was told that these were sophisticated investment vehicles that required confidential handling. Janet agreed to help me gather additional documentation, but we both understood the risk we were taking. If Bradley Thornton discovered our investigation, both of our careers would be over, and we could potentially face legal action for interfering with company operations. That afternoon, I returned to work and continued my regular duties while planning how to approach this investigation systematically. I needed to document everything thoroughly before taking any action because I knew that once I reported this fraud, there would be no going back. Around 5:30, most of my colleagues had left for the day. I stayed late to review additional client files and cross-reference them with the email evidence I had discovered. The building was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of evening cleaning crews. I was deep in concentration reviewing Mrs. Dorothy Chen's account records when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my office. The accounting department was on the same floor, and I assumed Janet had returned to collect some files. But the footsteps stopped directly outside my door, and I could see a shadow under the door gap indicating someone was standing there. After several minutes, the footsteps continued down the hall, and I heard the elevator doors open and close. I thought nothing of it until I tried to access a secured file directory that contained transaction logs for executive override approvals. My access had been denied. I tried logging out and back in, thinking it might be a network glitch. But when I attempted to access several other secure directories that were normally available to me as compliance manager, I received the same access denied message. Someone had changed my system permissions, and they had done it recently. My computer screen showed that my login credentials were still active and that I was properly connected to our internal network. But specific directories related to transaction processing, executive overrides, and email archives were no longer accessible. Whoever had restricted my access knew exactly what I had been investigating. I quickly saved the files I was currently reviewing and shut down my computer. As I gathered my belongings to leave, I noticed that the small window in my office door showed that the security camera in the hallway was pointed directly at my entrance. That camera had never been positioned that way before. Walking to the parking garage, I felt a growing sense of unease. Someone knew about my investigation, and they were already taking steps to limit my access to evidence. The footsteps outside my office, the restricted computer access, the repositioned security camera. These weren't coincidences. I drove home through evening traffic, my mind racing with the implications of what I had discovered. $8.2 million stolen from client accounts, systematic fraud orchestrated by a company executive, and now evidence that they knew I was investigating them. That night, after helping Emma with her calculus homework and listening to her talk about upcoming soccer playoffs, I sat in my bedroom and tried to decide what to do next. I could report what I had found to federal authorities immediately, but I knew that incomplete evidence might allow the perpetrators to destroy records and escape prosecution. I could confront Bradley Thornton directly, but that would give him an opportunity to create alternative explanations or frame me for the irregularities. Or I could continue gathering evidence while being extremely careful about how I proceeded. Janet Rodriguez had agreed to help, and together we might be able to document the full scope of this fraud before anyone could cover it up. I made my decision as I set my alarm clock for 6 the next morning. I would continue investigating, but I would also begin protecting myself by creating backup documentation and establishing communication with people outside the company who could verify what I had discovered. I had no idea how quickly everything was about to fall apart. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonably cold October wind that rattled the windows of our office building. I had spent the weekend creating secure backup copies of all the evidence I had gathered, storing them in a safety deposit box at my bank, and with a trusted friend who worked as a paralegal at a downtown law firm. When I arrived at work at 7:15, I immediately noticed that my office computer was already running, which was impossible since I had shut it down completely on Friday evening. Someone had accessed my system over the weekend. I logged in and discovered that my browser history had been cleared, and several files I had created were no longer in my personal folders. At 8:30, my phone rang with a call from Patricia Wells, our Human Resources Director. Her voice was artificially cheerful as she asked me to attend a brief meeting in Conference Room B at 9 o'clock to discuss some procedural updates. The timing felt suspicious, but I had no choice except to comply with the request. I walked into conference room B to find Patricia Wells seated at the head of the polished oak table, flanked by Bradley Thornton and an older man in an expensive navy suit who introduced himself as David Morrison from Morrison and Associates, the law firm that handled Pinnacle Financial's legal affairs. The atmosphere was formal and hostile despite Patricia's attempts to maintain a friendly demeanor. Patricia began by explaining that the company had become aware of some concerning behaviors that needed to be addressed immediately. She opened a manila folder and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement about unauthorized access to confidential client information and violations of internal security protocols. According to their allegations, I had been conducting unauthorized investigations into client accounts, accessing files outside my designated review parameters, and potentially compromising sensitive financial information. They claimed to have computer logs showing that I had viewed client records without legitimate business purposes and had printed confidential documents for unknown purposes. Bradley Thornton spoke next, his tone cold and accusatory. He claimed that 3 clients had filed complaints about privacy breaches, suggesting that someone had contacted them about their accounts without authorization and had made them concerned about the security of their investments. He implied that these complaints pointed directly to me as the source of inappropriate client contact. David Morrison then presented what he described as evidence of my violations. Computer printouts showed login records, file access logs, and printing activities that painted a picture of someone systematically violating client privacy and company security policies. The documentation looked official and damning, but I knew it had been carefully crafted to frame my investigation as criminal behavior. I attempted to explain that my review of client accounts was part of my routine compliance audit responsibilities, but Patricia Wells interrupted me by saying that preliminary reviews had indicated I had accessed files far beyond the scope of any authorized audit. She claimed that my activities had triggered security alerts, and that the external legal review had recommended immediate action to protect client confidentiality. The most devastating moment came when David Morrison informed me that they had already prepared a formal termination letter citing fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. He explained that employee fraud was a felony under federal law, and that the company was prepared to report my activities to both state licensing authorities and federal investigators. However, Morrison continued, the company was willing to consider an alternative arrangement if I was prepared to acknowledge my errors in judgment and resign voluntarily. He emphasized that resignation would allow me to maintain my professional licenses and avoid the criminal investigation that would automatically follow termination for cause. They gave me exactly 30 minutes to make my decision, and Patricia Wells mentioned that security personnel were waiting outside the conference room to escort me from the building regardless of which option I chose. The message was clear: this wasn't a negotiation or an opportunity to explain my actions. This was a trap that had been carefully constructed to eliminate me before I could expose their fraud. I asked to review the termination letter they had prepared, hoping to understand exactly what accusations they planned to make. The document was professionally written and detailed specific allegations about unauthorized access to client accounts, inappropriate contact with clients, and violations of confidentiality agreements. Reading it, I realized they had turned my investigation into evidence of criminal behavior. More disturbing, the letter included references to my personal financial situation, mentioning Emma's upcoming college expenses and my need for continued employment. They had researched my vulnerabilities and were using them to pressure me into accepting resignation rather than fighting their false accusations. As I sat in that conference room surrounded by people who were systematically destroying my career to hide their own crimes, I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced. They had stolen millions of dollars from trusting families, and now they were trying to frame me as the criminal. But I also realized that my anger wouldn't help me in this situation. I needed to think strategically about how to protect myself and preserve my ability to fight back. The 30-minute deadline was approaching, and David Morrison reminded me that failure to resign would result in immediate termination and criminal referral. I asked for a few minutes alone to consider my options, and they reluctantly agreed to step outside the conference room. Sitting alone at that conference table, I thought about Emma and how this decision would affect her future. I thought about the clients who were being robbed and who deserved justice. And I thought about my 11 years of dedicated service and how it was being twisted into evidence of criminal behavior. But most importantly, I thought about my knowledge of federal compliance regulations and how I might be able to use that knowledge to protect myself and expose the truth. I had spent 11 years learning the intricate details of financial regulations, and I knew there were procedural requirements that could work in my favor if I was smart about how I approached this situation. When Patricia Wells, Bradley Thornton, and David Morrison returned to the conference room, I told them I would resign voluntarily. I asked for access to my computer to type a formal resignation letter, and they agreed to allow me 15 minutes under supervision to prepare the document. Back at my desk with Patricia Wells watching over my shoulder, I opened a blank document and began typing what would become the most important sentence of my professional life. Instead of writing a standard resignation letter accepting blame and apologizing for my actions, I wrote, "I hereby resign from Pinnacle Financial Group, effective upon full completion of pending compliance audit per Federal Regulation 3A4. Patricia Wells barely glanced at the letter before printing it and asking me to sign. Bradley Thornton seemed satisfied that I was finally leaving voluntarily. David Morrison collected the signed resignation and informed me that my final paycheck would be processed within 2 weeks, according to company policy. None of them understood what I had actually written, and none of them bothered to research Federal Regulation 3A4 before accepting my resignation. They were so eager to get rid of me that they failed to realize I had just given myself the most powerful legal protection available under federal law. As I cleaned out my desk under the watchful eyes of security personnel, Janet Rodriguez appeared at my office door. She pretended to ask about some routine paperwork, but quietly slipped me a small flash drive while shaking my hand goodbye. Her quick whisper of good luck and her meaningful look told me she understood that this fight was far from over. Walking through the lobby of Pinnacle Financial for what I thought might be the last time I felt devastated, but not defeated. They had forced me out, but they had also made a critical error by accepting my strategically worded resignation. I now had time to plan my next move, and I had additional evidence that Janet had risked her own job to provide. That evening, as I helped Emma with her homework and tried to explain why I would be looking for a new job, I received an email that changed everything. The message was from Sarah Chen, a federal auditor with the Securities and Exchange Commission, confirming that surprise inspection of Pinnacle Financial Group was scheduled for the following week as part of a routine regulatory review. The compliance audit I had referenced in my resignation letter wasn't just a hypothetical requirement. It was a real federal investigation already in progress, and my resignation couldn't become effective until that audit was complete. I had accidentally purchased myself time and legal protection that neither I nor my former employers fully understood yet. But they were about to figure it out, and when they did, their lawyer was going to start calling me with desperate offers I had never imagined possible. The morning after my resignation, I woke up feeling strangely calm despite the uncertainty of my situation. Emma had already left for school, and I sat at my kitchen table with coffee and the business section of the Chicago Tribune, trying to process what had happened and plan my next steps. I spent the first part of the day researching Federal Regulation 3A4, the compliance requirement I had referenced in my resignation letter. What I discovered gave me hope for the first time in days. The regulation required that any personnel changes in compliance departments at investment firms be reported to federal regulators within 48 hours, along with certification that all ongoing compliance reviews had been completed satisfactorily. More importantly, the regulations specified that compliance officers could not be terminated or transferred while federal audits were pending, specifically to prevent companies from removing oversight personnel who might discover irregularities during investigations. The law was designed to protect exactly the situation I found myself in. I called Sarah Chen at the Securities and Exchange Commission to confirm the details of the upcoming audit at Pinnacle Financial. She explained that their review was part of a broader investigation into offshore investment vehicles that had raised concerns across multiple firms. Pinnacle Financial had been selected for examination because of unusual patterns in their international wire transfer activities. Sarah was surprised to learn about my resignation and asked detailed questions about the timing and circumstances. When I explained that I had been conducting a compliance audit and had discovered potential irregularities, she became very interested in speaking with me further. She scheduled a meeting for the following day and advised me not to discuss our conversation with anyone at Pinnacle Financial. That afternoon, I reviewed the evidence Janet Rodriguez had provided on the flash drive. Her documentation was even more comprehensive than I had hoped. She had been systematically copying transaction records, email communications, and authorization forms for months because her instincts had told her something was wrong with the new processing procedures Bradley Thornton had implemented. Janet's records showed that the fraud extended far beyond what I had initially discovered. Client funds had been used to cover Bradley's personal investments that had gone bad to pay for company expenses that weren't properly budgeted, and to create artificial profits that made the firm appear more successful than it actually was. The total amount of misappropriated funds was approaching $12 million. Most damaging were Janet's copies of email communications between Bradley Thornton and Richard Webb, the external accountant, discussing how to time the return of borrowed funds to avoid detection during audit periods. One email chain showed them specifically planning to restore client account balances before my quarterly review, then immediately transfer the funds back out again once my report was submitted. Another email revealed that they had been monitoring my computer activities and had developed what they called a Delilah protocol for avoiding detection during my compliance reviews. They had studied my audit patterns for over a year and had structured their theft specifically to avoid triggering my standard investigation procedures. Reading these communications made me feel sick but also vindicated. I had been unknowingly helping them steal money from our clients, but now I had evidence that could expose everything and potentially help recover the stolen funds. That evening, I called my friend Lisa Martinez, the paralegal who was storing copies of my evidence. I asked her to review the federal regulation I had referenced in my resignation letter and give me her opinion about my legal situation. Lisa had worked in employment law for 8 years and understood the complexities of workplace investigations. After reviewing the regulation and my resignation letter, Lisa was amazed at what I had accidentally accomplished. She explained that my resignation was effectively suspended until the federal audit was complete, which meant I remained an employee of Pinnacle Financial with all the rights and protections that status provided. More importantly, any attempt to process my resignation or change my employment status while the audit was pending would be a federal violation that could result in criminal charges. Lisa also pointed out that my status as a continuing employee meant that any harassment or intimidation related to my cooperation with federal investigators would qualify as witness tampering and obstruction of justice. If Pinnacle Financial tried to pressure me or retaliate against me during the audit period, they would be committing additional federal crimes. The next morning, I met with Sarah Chen and her colleague James Rodriguez, a criminal investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I provided them with all the evidence I had gathered, including Janet's flash drive and my analysis of the transaction patterns I had discovered. Sarah and James were impressed with the thoroughness of my documentation and the clear pattern of fraud it revealed. James explained that their investigation had actually begun 6 months earlier when Caribbean Financial Holdings was identified as a potential money laundering operation. Several investment firms had been transferring client funds to accounts at that institution, and Pinnacle Financial had shown the highest volume of suspicious transactions. What they needed now was someone with inside knowledge of how the fraud was being conducted and who was involved in the scheme. My evidence provided exactly the documentation they needed to move from investigation to prosecution. James offered me formal whistleblower protection under federal law, which would shield me from any retaliation and potentially provide financial compensation if their investigation led to successful prosecutions. I agreed to cooperate fully with their investigation, and Sarah explained that they would be conducting their audit of Pinnacle Financial the following week. They would need me to be available for consultation during the review, and my continuing employee status would allow them to request my assistance without alerting the company to my cooperation with federal authorities. That afternoon, my phone started ringing with calls from a number I didn't recognize. The caller identification showed Morrison and Associates, and I allowed the calls to go to voicemail while I considered how to respond. The first voicemail from David Morrison was polite but urgent, asking me to call him back to discuss some questions about my resignation letter. The second call an hour later was more direct. Morrison said they needed to clarify some language in my resignation that was creating complications for processing my departure from the company. He mentioned that there might be issues with my final paycheck and benefits continuation if we didn't resolve these questions quickly. By evening, Morrison had called 6 times, and his messages were becoming increasingly desperate. The final voicemail mentioned that Pinnacle Financial was prepared to offer a generous severance package if I would agree to submit an amended resignation letter with clearer language about my departure date. I didn't return any of the calls because I knew that Morrison had finally researched Federal Regulation 3A4 and realized that my resignation couldn't be processed while a federal audit was pending. They were beginning to understand that they couldn't get rid of me as easily as they had planned, and they were panicking about what that meant for their ability to continue hiding the fraud. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from Morrison and Associates offering me 6 months of salary continuation, full health insurance coverage for 1 year, and a positive employment reference if I would agree to sign an amended resignation letter that would take effect immediately. The letter emphasized that this was a limited time offer that would expire within 48 hours. I showed the letter to Lisa Martinez, who laughed out loud when she read it. She explained that their offer was essentially an admission that they knew my original resignation was invalid, and that they were desperate to find another way to remove me from the company before the federal audit began. That same afternoon, Sarah Chen called to inform me that the surprise audit would begin Monday morning, and that agents would be arriving at Pinnacle Financial at 8 o'clock to begin reviewing records. She asked me to be available by phone throughout the week in case they needed clarification about any of the evidence I had provided or had questions about company procedures. As I prepared for what I knew would be the most important week of my professional life, I felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. After 11 years of honest work and dedication to protecting client interests, I was finally going to have the opportunity to expose the fraud that had been conducted under my nose and to help recover millions of dollars stolen from trusting families. I had no idea that the investigation would uncover fraud far more extensive than anyone had imagined, or that my strategic resignation letter would become the key piece of evidence that allowed federal prosecutors to build their case against everyone involved. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a long storm. I woke up early, made coffee, and prepared for what I knew would be a day that would change everything for Pinnacle Financial Group. At exactly 8 o'clock, while I was having breakfast with Emma before she left for school, my phone started ringing. The first call was from David Morrison, and this time his voice contained none of the professional courtesy that had characterized his previous messages. He demanded that I call him back immediately to discuss what he called urgent legal matters related to my employment status. The panic in his voice was unmistakable. I allowed the call to go to voicemail and continued helping Emma gather her textbooks and soccer gear. She noticed that I seemed nervous and asked whether everything was okay with my job situation. I assured her that things were complicated, but that I was confident everything would work out for the best. By 9:30, Morrison had called 4 more times. His messages progressed from demanding to pleading to barely controlled anger. In his final voicemail, he offered me 12 months of salary continuation and full benefits if I would meet with him immediately to sign an amended resignation letter. He emphasized that this was my last opportunity to resolve what he called a simple misunderstanding about resignation procedures. At 10:15, my phone rang with a call from Sarah Chen. She was calling from Pinnacle Financial's offices where federal agents had arrived to begin their audit. She asked whether I could explain the executive override system that had been used to process many of the suspicious transactions because the current staff claimed to have limited knowledge about how that system operated. I spent 20 minutes on the phone with Sarah, walking her through the authorization codes, approval hierarchies, and documentation requirements that governed high-value transactions at Pinnacle Financial. I explained that executive overrides were supposed to be used only for time-sensitive emergency situations and required written justification within 24 hours of any transaction. Sarah told me that preliminary review of the records indicated that executive overrides had been used for 97 transactions during the past 18 months, totaling over $14 million. But that written justifications existed for fewer than 12 of those transactions. The pattern was even worse than my initial investigation had revealed. 2 hours later, Janet Rodriguez called me from her personal cell phone. She was whispering and sounded frightened as she explained that federal agents had arrived at the office and were interviewing employees about transaction processing procedures. She said that Bradley Thornton had been called into a meeting with the investigators and had not been seen since mid-morning. Janet told me that employees were being asked specific questions about my resignation and whether anyone had knowledge of why I had left the company. She was scheduled to be interviewed that afternoon and wanted to know whether she should mention the evidence she had been gathering or wait for the investigators to discover it independently. I advised Janet to be completely honest about everything she knew and to provide the investigators with any documentation she possessed. I reminded her that federal law protected whistleblowers from retaliation and that her cooperation could help protect the families whose money had been stolen. That afternoon, my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a man identified himself as Marcus Thornton and asked whether we could meet privately to discuss what he called a family emergency at Pinnacle Financial. His voice was shaky, and he sounded like he had aged several years since our last conversation. I agreed to meet Marcus at a coffee shop near my apartment, but I insisted that our conversation be brief and that I wouldn't discuss anything that might interfere with ongoing federal investigations. When I arrived at the coffee shop, I found Marcus sitting alone at a corner table looking pale and exhausted. Marcus began by apologizing for how I had been treated during my resignation meeting. He admitted that he had known about irregularities in the company's operations, but had hoped they could be resolved quietly without destroying the business his family had built over 30 years. He claimed that Bradley had assured him the financial problems were temporary and could be corrected through improved investment performance. As Marcus continued talking, I realized he was asking me to help limit the scope of the federal investigation. He suggested that perhaps some arrangement could be made to restore client funds without pursuing criminal charges that would destroy the family business and put innocent employees out of work. I told Marcus that I appreciated his apology, but that the decision about prosecution was entirely in the hands of federal authorities. I explained that my obligation as a compliance professional was to ensure that client interests were protected and that justice was served for the families who had been victimized by fraud. Marcus then revealed something that shocked me completely. He said that Bradley had told him the temporary borrowing from client accounts was necessary to cover losses from investments that would eventually recover their value. Marcus had believed that client funds were being temporarily used to prevent larger losses, and that everything would be restored before anyone suffered permanent harm. What Marcus didn't know was that Bradley had been using client funds for personal investments, luxury expenses, and covering previous losses that had no connection to client portfolio performance. The fraud was far more extensive and personal than Marcus had been led to believe. That evening, David Morrison called me 8 more times. His voicemails progressed from offering increased severance packages to threatening legal action for what he called breach of employment contracts and violation of confidentiality agreements. His final message warned me that failure to cooperate with their attempts to resolve this situation amicably could result in personal liability for damages to the company. I saved all of Morrison's voicemails and forwarded copies to Lisa Martinez and to Sarah Chen. Both of them agreed that Morrison's threats constituted potential witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, which were federal crimes that could result in additional charges against anyone involved. The next morning, Sarah Chen called to provide an update on their investigation. Federal agents had spent 2 days reviewing electronic records and interviewing employees, and their preliminary findings confirmed extensive financial fraud involving multiple parties within the company. Most significantly, they had discovered that the fraud extended beyond simple client fund theft. Bradley Thornton had been creating false documentation to inflate the company's apparent profitability, which had been used to secure additional credit lines and investment capital. The scheme had characteristics of both embezzlement and securities fraud, which carried severe federal penalties. Sarah also informed me that they had discovered evidence suggesting that some of the stolen client funds had been transferred to personal accounts controlled by Bradley Thornton and Richard Webb, the external accountant. They were working with international banking authorities to trace additional transfers and identify assets that could be seized to compensate victimized clients. The investigation had also revealed that my computer access had been monitored for over 6 months, and that Bradley Thornton had received daily reports about my activities from the IT department. They had been tracking my investigation from the beginning and had planned to frame me for the irregularities if I got too close to discovering their scheme. Most importantly for my situation, Sarah confirmed that my resignation letter had been legally brilliant, whether intentionally or accidentally. Federal regulations required that my employment status remain unchanged until the audit was complete, which gave me continued legal protection and prevented the company from eliminating me as a potential witness. That afternoon, I received a call from James Rodriguez, the FBI investigator. He informed me that they were prepared to make arrests and that my testimony would be crucial for securing convictions against everyone involved in the fraud. He also explained that federal law provided for financial compensation to whistleblowers whose information led to successful prosecutions and recovery of stolen funds. James asked whether I would be willing to testify before a federal grand jury and potentially at trial if criminal charges were filed. I agreed without hesitation, knowing that the families who had been robbed deserved justice, and that other compliance professionals needed to see that doing the right thing would be supported and protected. As I prepared for what I knew would be a very public legal process, I felt proud of the decision I had made to investigate the irregularities despite pressure from my superiors. My 11 years of experience and knowledge of federal regulations had allowed me to protect myself and preserve the evidence needed to expose a massive fraud. But I had no idea how extensive the criminal enterprise actually was, or how many additional victims would be discovered as federal investigators continued following the money trail that Janet Rodriguez and I had helped them uncover. Wednesday morning brought news that would validate everything I had risked my career to expose. I woke up to find my phone buzzing with text messages from former colleagues and several missed calls from reporters who had somehow obtained my contact information. The story had broken nationally, and Pinnacle Financial Group was front-page news in the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, "Federal Agents Arrest Investment Firm Executives in $14 million Fraud Scheme." Below that, in smaller print, longtime compliance manager's strategic resignation letter preserves evidence protects whistleblower status. I couldn't believe that my decision to word my resignation carefully had attracted this level of media attention. Sarah Chen called me at 8 o'clock to provide details about the arrests that had taken place Tuesday evening. Federal agents had arrested Bradley Thornton at his Lincoln Park condominium, Marcus Thornton at his suburban home in Winnetka, and Richard Webb at his accounting firm downtown. All three were being held without bail pending arraignment on federal charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The investigation had moved quickly once agents gained full access to Pinnacle Financial's electronic records. What they discovered was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 2 years, involving not just client fund theft, but also bank fraud, tax evasion, and violations of federal securities regulations. Janet Rodriguez had provided additional evidence that proved invaluable to federal prosecutors. Her systematic documentation of transaction irregularities had created a timeline that showed exactly when the fraud began, how it escalated, and which individuals were involved at each stage. Her cooperation had earned her formal whistleblower protection and guaranteed her job security during the investigation. Most shocking was the scope of the victimization. Federal investigators had identified 847 client accounts that had been affected by unauthorized transactions with total losses exceeding $12.3 million. The victims included elderly retirees who had lost their life savings, young families whose college funds had disappeared, and small business owners whose investment accounts had been systematically drained. Sarah explained that the fraud had been much more sophisticated than typical embezzlement cases. Bradley Thornton and Richard Webb had created a complex system of intermediary accounts and offshore transfers that made the money difficult to trace and recover. They had also falsified regulatory reports to hide their activities from federal oversight agencies. The securities fraud charges were particularly serious because Bradley Thornton had used stolen client funds to inflate the company's investment performance, which was then reported to prospective clients and regulatory authorities as evidence of the firm's success. New clients had been recruited based on fraudulent performance data, making them additional victims of the scheme. Federal prosecutors were confident they could secure convictions against all three defendants because of the comprehensive evidence that Janet Rodriguez and I had helped them gather. James Rodriguez told me that our investigation had provided the foundation for charges that could result in 20 to 30-year prison sentences for the primary defendants. I spent Wednesday morning meeting with prosecutors to review my testimony and ensure that I understood the legal procedures that would unfold over the coming months. Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Foster explained that my role as the compliance officer who discovered the fraud made me a crucial witness for establishing both the scope of the criminal activity and the defendant's knowledge that their actions violated federal law. Rebecca was particularly interested in my interactions with Marcus Thornton after I initially reported the irregularities. She explained that his attempt to discourage my investigation and his suggestion that I focus on other duties constituted evidence of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. His knowledge of the fraud and failure to report it to federal authorities made him equally culpable under federal law. That afternoon, I received a call that surprised me completely. David Morrison, the attorney who had been harassing me with phone calls all week, was requesting a meeting to discuss what he called a potential cooperation agreement. His tone was completely different from the threatening messages he had been leaving, and he sounded desperate to find some way to minimize his client's legal exposure. I consulted with Lisa Martinez and with Rebecca Foster before agreeing to meet with Morrison. Both advised me that any conversation should be recorded, and that Morrison's sudden interest in cooperation suggested that federal prosecutors had evidence even more damaging than what I had provided. The meeting took place at the federal courthouse downtown, with Rebecca Foster present to ensure that no inappropriate offers were made and that my rights were protected. Morrison appeared nervous and kept referring to notes as he attempted to explain his client's positions. Morrison began by claiming that Marcus Thornton had been deceived by Bradley Thornton and Richard Webb about the nature of the financial transactions, suggesting that the older man was a victim rather than a participant in the fraud. He argued that Marcus had trusted his nephew and had been misled about the legality and temporary nature of the client fund transfers. However, Rebecca Foster quickly challenged this narrative by presenting email evidence showing that Marcus Thornton had been receiving regular reports about the offshore accounts and had personally authorized several of the larger transactions. His knowledge of the fraud was well documented, and his attempt to discourage my investigation proved his understanding that criminal activity was taking place. Morrison then attempted to negotiate reduced charges for Bradley Thornton in exchange for cooperation in recovering stolen funds and identifying additional victims. He suggested that his client had information about other investment firms that might be engaging in similar fraudulent activities. Rebecca Foster's response was swift and decisive. Federal prosecutors had sufficient evidence to secure convictions without any cooperation from the defendants, and the crimes were too serious to warrant plea negotiations at this stage of the proceedings. The focus would be on full prosecution and maximum recovery of stolen funds for victims. That evening, I received a phone call that brought me more satisfaction than anything that had happened during this entire ordeal. Frank Sullivan, the retired police officer whose account had shown unauthorized withdrawals, called to thank me for exposing the fraud and protecting families like his from further losses. Frank explained that federal agents had contacted him to confirm that his account had been victimized and to provide information about asset recovery procedures. He told me that he had been worried about his financial security, but had been afraid to complain because he thought the investment firm might terminate his account and cause him additional problems. Frank's call was followed by similar messages from Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the elderly widow whose account I had reviewed during my initial investigation, and from the family of Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, whose funds had been transferred using forged authorization forms. Each of these families expressed gratitude for my willingness to risk my career to protect their financial security. As I reflected on the week's events, I realized that my decision to investigate the irregularities despite pressure from my superiors had accomplished exactly what I had hoped when I first entered the compliance profession. I had protected client interests, exposed criminal activity, and helped ensure that justice would be served for families who had trusted their financial security to our firm. But most importantly, I had proven to myself that doing the right thing, even when it requires personal sacrifice, ultimately leads to outcomes that justify the risks. My strategic resignation letter had preserved both my legal status and the evidence needed to prosecute the fraud, turning what appeared to be a career-ending betrayal into an opportunity for professional vindication. The media attention and public recognition of my role in exposing the fraud was gratifying, but what mattered most was knowing that 847 families would have the opportunity to recover their stolen funds, and that other compliance professionals would see that integrity and courage are supported by federal law. As I prepared for the lengthy legal process that lay ahead, I felt confident that my decision to prioritize client protection over job security had been exactly the right choice, both professionally and personally. 6 months later, I sat in the witness box of Federal District Court in downtown Chicago, watching Bradley Thornton listen as Judge Patricia Williams sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for 5 years. Marcus Thornton had already been sentenced to 7 years with requirements for full restitution to victims, and Richard Webb received 10 years plus permanent disbarment from practicing accounting. The sentencing hearing marked the end of a legal process that had completely transformed my life and career in ways I could never have imagined when I first discovered those suspicious transactions in Mrs. Eleanor Ashford's account. Federal prosecutors had successfully convinced the jury that the defendants had operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had systematically stolen from hundreds of trusting families over more than 2 years. The asset recovery process had been remarkably successful due to the comprehensive evidence that Janet Rodriguez and I had helped federal investigators gather. Asset seizures, including Bradley Thornton's condominium, Marcus Thornton's vacation home, luxury vehicles, and frozen offshore accounts, had recovered $9.4 million of the stolen funds. Additional recovery came from insurance policies and professional liability coverage that protected client accounts. Most importantly, for the victimized families, federal deposit insurance and investment protection programs covered the remaining losses, ensuring that every affected client recovered their full account value plus accrued interest. Frank Sullivan, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, and hundreds of other families received complete restoration of their retirement savings, college funds, and investment accounts. My role in exposing the fraud had been officially recognized by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which presented me with their Outstanding Service Award for protecting investor interests and maintaining integrity in financial markets. The ceremony took place in Washington, D.C., with Emma proudly watching from the audience as federal officials praised my courage and professional dedication. The whistleblower compensation program provided me with financial security I had never expected. Federal law awarded me 15% of the recovered funds, totaling over $1.4 million in recognition of the information and evidence I had provided. This compensation allowed me to establish college funds for Emma and to purchase our own home for the first time. Career opportunities had emerged from unexpected directions. 3 major investment firms offered me senior compliance positions with substantial salary increases, and federal regulatory agencies recruited me for oversight roles that would allow me to help protect other firms from similar fraud. I ultimately accepted a position as Senior Director of Compliance with the Securities and Exchange Commission, working directly with the team that investigates investment fraud. Emma had watched this entire process unfold with amazement and pride. Her college applications included essays about learning integrity and courage from watching her mother choose principles over personal security. She received early admission to Northwestern University for pre-veterinary studies, with scholarships covering her full tuition and expenses. Janet Rodriguez had also been recognized for her crucial role in gathering evidence and exposing the fraud. She received a promotion to accounting manager at the firm that acquired Pinnacle Financial's legitimate client accounts, and she became a sought-after speaker at professional conferences about recognizing and reporting financial irregularities. The most unexpected outcome was a letter I received from Marcus Thornton 6 weeks after his sentencing. Writing from federal prison in Indiana, he apologized for his role in the fraud and acknowledged that my integrity and professional judgment had been exactly what the situation required. He admitted that family loyalty had clouded his judgment and that he should have supported my investigation instead of trying to discourage it. Marcus expressed gratitude that my actions had prevented additional families from being victimized and had limited the ultimate scope of the criminal enterprise. He wrote that prison had given him time to reflect on the damage caused by prioritizing family relationships over legal and ethical obligations, and he hoped his example would help other business owners recognize when family loyalty becomes complicity in criminal activity. The case had attracted national attention and led to strengthened federal protections for compliance officers who report suspected fraud within investment firms. Congressional hearings examined how regulatory oversight could be improved to detect sophisticated schemes earlier, and new legislation increased penalties for executives who intimidate or retaliate against employees reporting suspected criminal activity. Professional organizations in the compliance field used my experience as a case study for training programs that teach compliance officers how to recognize fraud, gather evidence systematically, and protect themselves legally when reporting suspected criminal activity. My strategic resignation letter became a model for how regulatory knowledge can be applied to preserve legal protections during corporate investigations. Most personally satisfying was the opportunity to mentor other compliance professionals facing similar ethical dilemmas in their own careers. Through speaking engagements and professional consultations, I helped colleagues understand that federal law provides robust protection for employees who prioritize client interests over corporate pressures. As I reflect on this experience 18 months later, I realize that my decision to investigate those suspicious transactions despite personal and professional risks led to outcomes that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Not only were the criminal perpetrators held accountable and victimized families made whole, but the legal precedent established through this case strengthened protections for other compliance professionals facing similar challenges. The deeper life lesson that emerged from this experience is that integrity isn't just about doing what's right when it's easy and supported by others. True integrity means finding creative and strategic ways to protect what matters most, even when powerful people are determined to prevent you from succeeding. Sometimes the system that appears designed to silence you becomes the very tool that amplifies your voice and ensures justice prevails. Emma often asks me whether I would make the same choice again, knowing the stress and uncertainty it caused our family during those difficult months. My answer is always the same. Protecting 847 families from continued theft was worth every moment of fear and every professional risk I faced. The most profound realization has been that courage isn't the absence of fear, but rather the decision to act according to your principles despite that fear. When I discovered evidence of massive fraud, I felt terrified about confronting powerful people and potentially losing everything I had worked 11 years to build. But I also knew that remaining silent would have made me complicit in harming innocent families who trusted us with their financial security. My experience demonstrates that federal regulations exist specifically to protect employees who choose principle over personal security, but only if those employees understand their rights and apply them strategically. Knowledge of compliance law became my most powerful tool for preserving both evidence and legal protections during a corporate investigation designed to frame me for the crimes I was trying to expose. What started as the worst professional crisis of my career became the foundation for greater purpose, financial security, and professional recognition than I had ever imagined possible. The families who recovered their stolen funds, the regulatory improvements that will protect future investors, and the strengthened legal precedent for whistleblower protection represent lasting positive changes that emerged from choosing integrity over convenience. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where doing the right thing required risking everything you had worked to achieve? How did you find the courage to prioritize principles over personal security? And what lessons did that experience teach you about the importance of integrity in your own life and career? I want to thank each of you for watching this story and for supporting content that highlights how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences by choosing courage over comfort. Your engagement with these stories helps demonstrate that integrity and justice matter to all of us regardless of our individual circumstances. Please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below about times when you've had to choose between personal security and doing what you knew was right. Like this video, if you believe that protecting others sometimes requires personal sacrifice, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who refuse to let powerful interests silence their voices when justice was at stake. Share this story with friends and family members who work in finance compliance or any profession where they might face pressure to ignore wrongdoing, because understanding your legal rights and protections could make the difference between being victimized by corporate fraud and becoming the person who stops it from continuing. Until next time, remember that your integrity is your most valuable professional asset, and that federal law exists specifically to protect employees who choose to do the right thing even when powerful people are determined to prevent them from succeeding.